Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Free Your Mind, Part 3 of the House of the Intellect series. Now, Barzan in House of the Intellect, the book, tells this story of a museum director who had a show on, I believe it was the Impressionists, and it was popular. There were lines out the door. Every show was sold out. And the board of the museum asked him to do a survey on what the people who had attended the show thought of the show. And he said no. And they said, no, we really, really want you to do this survey, so do the survey. So rather than do the survey, he resigned. Now, why? Why would someone resign from a position like a museum director under such what seems, on the face of it, to be such a small or trivial ask on the part of the directors or the board of the museum? And that is what the purpose of, or the topic of this lecture is. Why? Like, how do you keep your mind free? And Barzan is using him as an example, and I'm using as an example of what happens with and how trained we are into processes that do not emphasize the freedom of our minds, quite the contrary. And obviously, having a free mind, along with dignity and intellectual integrity, are key to and grow out of and feed back on each other, maintaining the House of the Intellect and participating in the communities that are built up around this sort of environment. And the best example I could give of historically that will help elucidate why this museum director was probably correct to resign is the position of doctors. So for about 300 years, say from 1700 to, late 1600s to late 19th century, early 20th century, doctors, as in medical doctors, were pillars of the House of the Intellect. I mean, they were, or foundations, what's the better analogy? I'm not sure, but they were crucial to the operation of participation in and maintenance of the House of the Intellect. And this was because of a couple of particular reasons. One, they had an education. So their education to get into med school tended to require classical languages, at least Latin, often Latin and Greek, and a broad humanistic education. So this put them in the gave them the background to communicate generally with basically any educated person around them, and even in the broader landscape of Europe during the time that Latin was sort of the lingua franca of the educated classes and communication. And so on one hand, their background necessary to get into medical school prepared them with this very broad and powerful educational foundation, which allowed them to communicate. Then they went through a period of, intense medical training, as you would expect. And then when they came out, they were often set up as independent or quasi-independent agents. And so throughout European history in particular, by the way, this is also true to an extent in Islamic world, where you had certification of doctors, they became kind of institutions in themselves. So they had the resources and the community respect to then pursue their own academic or intellectual or artistic interests, if they were. Not all doctors, of course, were. Some just pursued being doctors and making money or doing whatever else they're interested in, racing horses, But many of them, because of their background and personal predilections, decided to pursue humanistic, artistic, aesthetic, cultural pursuits. And so, the list of famous doctors who, are artistically or literarily successful, it just goes on and on. Carl Jaspers, Freud, Jung, William James, Keats, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, you can just, Anton Chekhov, I believe, right? You go through the list and you go, wow, all these people were doctors. But below that level of just like, phenomenal contributors on the artistic front, you have all the salons that were hosted by doctors and their wives. So respected members of the community, they tended to have, nicer places. And then one way they achieved status was to have, to hold salons and have people over to their house and entertain writers and historians and artists and these kinds of people. See Proust, right? Like this, he makes fun of them, but also it is a loving fun that he makes, and recherche Thomas Perdue about these kinds of salons and activities of the educated bourgeoisie, of which he was a member, of course. They tended to commission artworks. They wanted paintings of their wives and themselves and their mistresses and their horses and their houses and, so their families. So they tended to do a lot of commissions that kept artists working. So this gave, jobs to artists. They subscribed to a lot of journals and newspapers, and so they purchased books, and that was seen as being important. And so you can look at the price of some of the journals from a few hundred years ago and books from a few hundred years ago or 150 years ago, adjusted for inflation, they're shockingly expensive. Like a journal that today, you might be $200 to get at that journal. And so someone who you knew had this very expensive journal that comes out maybe 4 times a year, that was valuable. And like, I want to come over to coffee to Dr. Dox's because I know that he has this journal and we can chat and I can read it and we can talk about its contents because I'm a lowly philosopher or a would-be writer. There's no way I'm going to be able to afford that, and it's not in the local library or whatnot. And so they were actually could become communal resources, again, for those that were so inclined. And this pattern of life that existed for several hundred years, and again, generation after generation, provided this foundation of support and interest and community intrigue and conferred status so that you can read the biographies and memoirs of writers big and small or thinkers. And often they're like, oh, well, the good news is I haven't eaten for 2 days, but I have been invited to Dr. Smith's place, and he's got a big dinner on, and so that's going to be great. And I'll meet some people there, and he's interested in me because even though I'm just a small person, I did get an article published in a journal he subscribes to, so now I'm a person of note. And so because they're interested, they confer status on people in their community, and so all of a sudden, again, the house of the intellect starts to grow up around them, and even obscure poets or small writers or playwrights or painters have an entree into a broader society that respects them, at least in secondhand, because, this doctor who seems to know things and is a pillar of the community has invited this person, so we should at least give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's chat with them. Perhaps we'd be interested. Maybe we can have them over to our house. And so it goes. And so whole communities were built up by doctors because of their, not just their great achievements, like, James and Chekhov, et cetera. Like they weren't necessary. They were, powerful in themselves. But even at that next level of just material, financial, communal support and respect that was extended to whole groups of individuals. And so that position of respect was vital to helping to create that. And that was doctors for hundreds of years, not just for one generation or 2 generations, but for many, many generations. How has that changed? Well, a couple of things have happened. This is not the case today. It could be the case today, but it is not the case today, very broadly speaking, and particularly in the United States. A couple of things. One, the form of education that one needs today to become a doctor is very narrow, very rigorous, and in fact, one could even call it abusive. It's sort of a hazing project. There's no evidence this produces better doctors, by the way. It just is a way of sorting for basically maniacal people. My niece is getting ready to go into med school, and what she's had to do and the kind of hurdles she's had to overcome has caused her to be just really driven and focused and narrow. Miguel, a friend of mine, the son I never had, as I call him, he also went through med school, had a similar experience, and he really suffered from it because it just narrows your mind, takes all your time, takes 100% of your focus. And again, without any evidence that this produces better doctors, it's clearly just a program of hazing and sort of constantly raising the ladder up behind one. So it used to be much easier to be a doctor. Well, we'll just make it harder and harder and harder. This makes doctors rare and hence more valuable. And, the feedback loop goes on from there. And so they do not have a broad education, quite the contrary. They have a technical education. They get the same kind of education as like someone who fixes engines on a jet, or someone who, it's a technical education. It's no longer a broad humanistic education, which is bizarre, but also tells you a lot about how we have come to conceptualize the world. You're going to work on a human being. However, we don't view them as a human. We view them as a jet engine, which is, of course, when you think about, obviously absurd, and yet, there you have it, right? Like this is what we think of when we think of the medical profession. This is how people are trained. And so then when they go through this hazing machine, they go through this brutal education process and sorting process, they come out into a world in which, because humans are jet engines, they are prioritizing the institutions they work on. It's very difficult to be an independent doctor now, and particularly in the United States. You're usually in a doctor's group or you're working with a hospital. They want mass throughput because that's how you make money. You make money through volume. You make volume through passing as many patients through as you possibly can. And so rather than spending time with your patients, understanding their problems and getting a holistic sense of them as people, you have, 15 minutes maybe to see a patient, and you've got to see patient after patient after patient, and you need to see 10, 15, 20 patients a day just to meet your minimums. And so no longer are you thinking about the person holistically. No longer do you have this broader outlook. Not that you've been trained to think this way. Also, the system does not want you to think this way. And so you work brutal hours, overwhelmed by the number of patients that you have, and having narrowed your mind and taken all your energy away. But the reward is not helping people. It's not fixing people. It's not making people better, although I'm sure that's still there. It is average salary in the United States, $300,000 to $400,000 a year for a medical doctor. Less if you're doing something, general practice, way more if you're doing something like, thoracic surgery. But, $300,000 to $400,000 is a nice, average median type number. Lets you know that this is industrial medicine, right? Here's a bunch of money. Now shut up and fix the jet engines. And so now you're off of work. You're exhausted, you're worn out, and notice you've been poisoning yourself a little bit because you know that this is not a jet engine. You know this is a person. You know you would like to spend more time with them, but there's so much bureaucracy, there's so much paperwork, there's so much regulation that it's always a struggle. You're always torn. And so you're off work. Now you're exhausted, but you also have to manage this relatively huge amount of money. So now you've got investments and you have to worry about tax policy. So the feedback cycle here is to narrow your mind, have a process that's slightly self-poisoning to very self-poisoning. I've talked to doctors who have really struggled with this. They just find it just brutal and exhausting because they don't want to spend 20 minutes with a patient or 15 minutes with a patient. They want to spend 40 minutes because that patient needs 40 minutes, but they just can't. Like, it's just basically not allowed. And the things they want to do may not be what is supposed to be done. And so that creates more time and more paperwork, and this just spirals continuously. So you're off of work, but you've worked long shifts, you're exhausted, you don't feel good about yourself, and you've got a whole bunch of money to manage. And so, you have houses and so you don't have either the educational background or the communal environment that allows you to free your mind, think your own thoughts, and approach the world in your own way. You're trying to meet external metrics, number of patients seen a day, number of surgeries done in a week, whatever the endless series of metrics that bureaucracy is going to come up with for you to meet. And this is just soul crushing, right? And so doctors have lost this capacity. No longer do they look at the world as like, oh, I have extra resources, I have extra energy, I have this free mind, I have this broad education, I want to explore it, I want to invest in communal projects that allow me, all that sort of environment or sense of the house of the intellect that doctors used to be so crucial to. the transformation of society around doctors. Again, there's no reason to blame doctors for this, by the way. This was not a plan by doctors, right? They didn't think, oh, let's make this system as brutal as possible so that we never have free time or enjoy ourselves. But the evolution of our culture and the hostility of our culture towards the House of the Intellect is just demonstrated by the fact that what used to be a core function or a core group that really made this thing run, that really helped keep it going, has just dramatically declined, has fallen on very hard times. And not because they're just loving life, right? It's not because they've said, oh, I'm not interested in books and all this because I'm doing something else. It's because it becomes this just all-absorbing, mind-killing process that they're asked to pursue. And so this goes back to, why did this museum director need to resign? And he decided he needed to resign because he didn't want to become a doctor. Because notice what they're saying is, hey, we've just had a show. The show was hugely popular, sold out, people lined up to see it, couldn't get any more in the museum. Great. Now we want to know, now we want to measure, now we want to, so okay, now I'm going to have to take my time as museum director when I should be thinking about beauty, I should be thinking about shows, I should be thinking about the kind of experiences I want. And we want to survey our users, get some numbers. Was that show a 7.7 or a 9.2? And that is this just path that we've gone so far down today. I mean, I can't imagine what Barzan would think if he were alive today. I mean, we're just so far down that path that it's just crushing. I mean, again, this is, I mentioned before, this is one reason I left the university, is because for years and years and years, I was able to avoid this. And in the last couple of years that I was there, I finally wasn't able to avoid this kind of soul-crushing, pointless, bureaucratic exercise anymore. And I just couldn't take it. Eventually I became like the museum director, because it's just like, oh, come on, how much senseless paperwork do you do before you go, this is just damaging my mind. This is damaging my spirit. This is taking away the freedom of my intellect and trying to convince me that these things are important, which is one way to go wrong. Or I can say, I know they're not important, but I'm going to do them anyway. Look, obviously there's a certain amount of that in every life. I'm not talking about purity, and I'm not talking about the ivory tower shining on the hill, this kind of thing. But if you consistently spend all of your time doing things about which you feel that they're demeaning or hypocritical or pointless, right? This also destroys the freedom of your mind, because part of your mind knows that you're doing silly things and yet you keep doing them. And so basically you pit your mind against yourself, right? This also cages your mind. It's a type of poison to do the trivial, or to feel hypocritical, or to just, everybody's sarcastic, or to be filled with irony, or cynical. I guess cynicism is the best word. Everybody's like, cynical about everything. Well, being cynical is not it may be an accurate response sometimes, but it's also a type of poison, particularly when you're being cynical about the things that you do. Right? Again, this is not I'm so hip, my mind is so free because I'm cynical about everything. It's no, you're cynical about everything as a measure of how trapped your mind is. You're aware that things are unwell or silly or ridiculous, but you continue to participate in them. That's cynicism. Right? This is that sensibility, and it really degrades and erodes your sense of your own mental freedom, because again, it's wrong. This is what exhausts the doctors in part, is because they know they should spend often, not invariably, but often more time with the patient, but they also know that they're not supposed to. And so they go, okay, great. Well, that was pretty good. Right? I guess that was that was okay. That really wasn't good. Okay, I'm going to press the boundary this time because I really need to, right? And to be in an environment where you're constantly forced to sort of work against yourself and your own desires to do well and to understand someone more fully, And then to go, oh, well, the bureaucracy is exploiting us, and it's all for money and all this. I'm very cynical about it. This doesn't help your patients, and this doesn't help you, right? This is not a good outlook. And so again, I focus so much on the doctors because we look to and we say, oh, that it's the general culture, it's the anti-intellectualism. And it is, but it's not necessarily where you would think. It's in these subtle things and these invisible or sort of invisible things like, hey, let's try and measure things all the time. Let's try to put everything on a wheel. Let's make the education really difficult so people have to slave and suffer to get that, right? Those sorts of things actually enclose our minds and trap them because we get involved in systems and patterns that are unhelpful for us. An example that I have is when I was at the college again, is they wanted us to do what were we doing for diversity and inclusion survey. And what this amounted to was someplace, they needed to turn in a bunch of metrics, of course. So it's just this endless generation of nonsense about what the college was doing for diversity and inclusion. And the college didn't want to do anything because that would be work. So instead, they just sent forms to all of the professors and said, well, what were we doing to do diversity and inclusion? And then, of course, they would collate that and say, oh, this is what the college is doing, which is, that's hilarious. But anyway, that was kind of what the score was. And so I thought, oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, generally, I just ignored this kind of stuff. But this time, my boss said, hey, could you please fill this out? And so I wrote down, yeah, well, for diversity and inclusion, I'm willing to sleep with my students regardless of sex, race, religion, gender identity, just all across the board. So that's what I wrote down. Which is a cynical response, by the way. And when my boss read this, she was not enthusiastic about this response. And she was like, "Don't do this, Wes. Like, this is bad person. And I'm like, yeah. And so on one hand, I thought it was hilarious, and it was kind of a bit of a fight back. But it was also that slippery slope of like, okay, I know that was a silly response. Again, by the way, I'm also all in favor of diversity and inclusion. It was just that the cynicism of the bureaucratic model, which was to try and take credit for the work that people were doing so that they looked good. Like there was no benefit to anybody else who was doing all the work for doing this. The university just wanted to look like they were doing something. And so it was the cynicism and the bureaucratic exploitation that bothered me. But rather than just ignoring it, which I think is what I usually did, this time for some reason it rose to the level where I thought I would give this cynical response. And that really showed that I was getting to the end of my time, right? Because I needed to just not respond to those things, and generally I didn't. But that's where you get stuck in these little corners. And again, it's not purity. You could just fill it out and go, okay, I do this and that, and it's all fine, it's all great, and then everybody's happy, and you don't worry about it. And if it doesn't bother you, that's fine. And of course, there's a little bit of this everywhere. So again, not a purity race. But when you get in that position where you feel like you're continually being forced to think in these boxes and respond to the world in these boxes, that's where you really get into trouble. And part of this extends to like, how do you free your mind? And this is, by the way, this is not just, think whatever you think, everything you thought you have is great. No, often we think stupid and crazy things, but I find it challenging now. So rarely in the world are we asked the two important and very related questions, which is A, what do you think? And B, why do you think that? So it's the second part in particular that really allows people to explore and expand and understand themselves and their world. The problem is the why. I mean, because we're rarely asked what we think, because we're just like, give it 3 stars, 2 star, 5 star. Like, no, like there's no, what do you think? This is a difficult question often. It's actually, if you, again, think about it, hello, Heidegger, what is called thinking. If you think about this, like knowing exactly what you think is actually quite difficult. One of the writing assignments that my students would always struggle with, and I think everybody struggles with this, is they would say, I know what I think, but I'm having a hard time putting it down on paper. To which I would respond, you don't know what you think. This is what it's difficult to write it down, in part because you actually don't have the clarity necessary to write it down. And the reason for that is often because we're so rarely ever asked, what do we actually think? And very importantly, why do we think that? Because it's often in the exploration of the why that the beauty, the depth, the richness of a thought comes to the fore. And you can think, I don't know, if we're thinking literary stuff, like maybe you don't like Anton Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, which is generally considered a great play. But it's the why that probably matters. Like, if someone says, the gambling metaphor and they're playing car, I don't know, I just find it all so very, tedious or something. I don't know, some good reason not to like Anton Chekhov. So you go, oh, that's interesting, because I could agree with you. I could say, yes, I see that in the play. But for me, I liked it. And so now we're agreeing, even though somebody likes it and somebody else doesn't like it or doesn't care for it or, that kind of thing. And so the richness of an event, of an experience, comes in that sort of exploration of why it resonates or doesn't resonate, and the ways and the memories that it brings up and the history and all this evocation that metrics and measuring and trying to rush and, see 20 patients a day, just strips all of that out. It just drains the capacity for the mind to be free, to explore, to reflect, to experience, and then to articulate, and then for that process to be reciprocal and ongoing. And so while it seems silly at some level, like we're like, oh, you're a director of a museum, that's a great job, why would you ever let go of that just because they want you to do a survey? If you identify the survey as, look, this is the absolute wrong direction, and if we start going down this direction, everything I love about being a museum director, love of art, appreciation of the patrons, interaction with the community, is just going to get taken away and washed out and overwhelmed by this, right? Pretty soon we'll just be in this bureaucratic system, and it'll be, we'll have the business model and how do we maximize all, right? And here we go, right down that metrics, and all of the human part, all of the mental freedom part will just vanish. And that's what he was concerned with, and hence this is the function of his resignation. It would be as if every doctor in the United States today said, look, we need to be able to spend 40 minutes with a patient. We're probably not going to spend 40 minutes with every patient, but we need to spend 40 minutes to an hour. If they all said that, of course, the system would have to change to allow that. But there seems no evidence that there is a big push for this, unfortunately or fortunately, but we'll see. And so I just use this as a long example, perhaps too long, I'm sorry, but it is how core, and that we encounter this everywhere, particularly with some of the most educated. Again, these are the people who are the most educated in our society. And they've been stripped out of the house of the intellect. So that natural level of support and communal respect and financial support, all those resources have been taken away. And we don't even notice it. It just kind of slips away without our being entirely aware. And then we look around and we go, oh, I feel homeless. Oh, I feel like there is no place there. And in part, it's because a lot of it has, in fact, been taken away. A lot of it has been destroyed by this dramatic change in mindset. So if you feel that way, don't be surprised. So more hopefully, and again, I'll end every one of these, is how do we then cultivate this in ourselves? And it's a couple of steps. I've got a 27, I don't know how many steps are the correct number, but a few to think about. One is avoid taking in poison, because this is one of the most dangerous aspects of this, is if you, like I said, with the survey that I probably shouldn't have responded to the way I did, like if that becomes a pattern where you just feel that you're drowning in this, eventually it is damaging, right? It does limit your capacity to be free, to actually because you just feel the cynicism, you feel the waste, you feel that you're just taking in a little bit of poison all the time. And at some point, we just can't process that out. And so when you're not at work, your sense of yourself is not sufficiently grounded and sufficiently strong to give you that free play of mind, to give you that sense of, oh yes, I've done good work, but I'm, of a different sort, and now I will go and do something else. I mentioned you can see this again, not just in intellectual spheres, by the way. It's the difference between a craftsman who goes to work, does good work, feels good about what they've done, and then they go home, and now they have a sense of their own personal value and worth, which allows them to contribute to, participate in, reflect on intellectual, aesthetic, cultural pursuits if they're so inclined. But the same sort of construction worker who is just trying to turn out, get as many things done as quickly as possible, they know it's being shoddy, they're stealing stuff from work, right? This just degrades that. And it creates that sense of, you're not being true to yourself and your own mental capacities. And you know it. It's only that you know it that's the problem, right? This is part of it. So if you can avoid as much as possible taking in the poison, or if you identify the poison, try not to be cynical about it, right? This was the mistake I think I made, which was, don't just, that cynicism thing, just try to avoid that and go, well, this is something I have to do to allow other good things to happen, so I'll do it. Or, you know what, this is just silly, I'm just not going to do it. Let's see what happens if you do that. By the way, often if you don't do things, people don't care nearly as much as if you do things incorrectly, as I did. I once went for 2 years without opening my campus email, which was great, by the way. But it turns out that eventually you get in trouble for that. But it took 2 years. So I had 2 years of total freedom, which was spectacular. Resist the endless desire to measure or quantify, which is the inverse of learn to value the subjective. So part of what kills this is, what are the 10 best movies of all time? Right? Like that sort of measuring metric, both debate, even the outlook, is very damaging to free thought and a free mind, because it so narrows the possibility of outcomes of your thinking that you're already channeled into certain kinds of arguments and outlooks and mindsets that are just very damaging. I mentioned this in the Jung's Red Book lectures, that once you accept a certain framing of an argument, so much follows from that we don't tend to see. I'll have another example of this coming up shortly. And that framing element, where if you let me frame an argument, I will win the argument, right? Like that's one of the keys, is once it's framed in this, what's the 10 best? What's the greatest of all time? Who's the greatest painter? What's the most beautiful woman, right? Whatever the measuring thing is, once you're in this debate functionally structured that way, your mind is trapped. You're in the confines of this very small box, and we don't tend to notice it because it's so omnipresent now. Everything is 3.5 stars, 2 stars, 5 stars, all of these things, rather than what are the subtle, subjective, personal elements. And notice this is what it does, is it strips out the personal. Because when you try to quantify, it makes it theoretically universal. But the humanities, humanism, the house of the intellect, is nothing if not built on the personal and the subjective. This is the point of the whole program. And that's where the value comes in. So that when you don't value yourself, you don't have the thing that you need to enrich the house of the intellect. Plus, you don't feel rich. And so that quantifying, that elimination of subjectivity is itself just hugely dangerous. And yet, I don't need to point this out, it's just everywhere. Technological dependence. So this one comes up all the time. The desire for, it's not that technology is bad, it's that new tools get introduced which allow us to do amazing things. It's great, it's wonderful, but then the need of the tool, the need of the technology subverts that which is supposed to be making possible. And so, if you look online, I've a friend who's a recording engineer, and he lived through the entire process from early multi-track to more multi-track to digital technology today. So he's gone through the whole arc, and we've talked about what happens because of the technology itself, how it changes recording. And one of the things that he and other recording engineers have articulated is that before, there was a cost to pay every time you did a take, because you had to rewind the tape. Tape was expensive. It lost quality as you used it. Studio time was expensive. And so even in the studio, there was this element of live performance. And okay, we've got to get this right the first time. There were stakes, right? There was a commitment to trying to do it right now. Once you can do every take 100 times, and then you can sit and mess with every take in an infinite number of ways for an infinite amount of time, it's a lot of the joy and spontaneity of the process itself, and many people argue the outcome of that process becomes much less good. But certainly many, many artists and recording engineers have said the process has now just become hateful, right? And so what used to be fun, experimental, creative, interactive, some of that has been sucked away. And so by limit technological dependence, it's just, I guess maybe a better way to articulate that is to say, look at the technology that you interact with, particularly you interact with in ways that you're trying to be creative or expand your mind, and say, does this help me? Or is the technology really kind of becoming a barrier? Does it interfere? Does the technology itself shape the way I have to interact with this or think about this or respond to it? At which point, again, your mind is being trapped by, guided by the narrow confines of some technological requirements that were not there for you originally, right? And I've done many experiments on this and trying to figure out what's the best way to implement technology for education and for learning and for expanding the mind. And it is a challenge. Screens, I'm very suspicious of screens. Not universally bad, nothing is, just very suspicious of them in general. I like paper, I like ink, I like actual physical books, but it's also great to be able to look up a book. You can only have so many. To have access to millions might be great, right? But be careful of, and be suspicious of technology and its impacts. And the more you can make yourself aware of them, and the more you can free yourself from them, probably the better you are and the freer your mind will be. Bureaucracy. Now, I mentioned bureaucracy just because it's so omnipresent. In a way, I think this is one of the changes that's hard for us to imagine, is how much more bureaucratic our society is today than it was 100 years ago. There are so many layers of interaction and paperwork and digital things that have to be taken care of. I mean, the joke I make is I feel like the people who design the modern world that we inhabit read Kafka. They read The Trial. They read The Castle. But they thought it was a how-to guide. They thought it was a utopia, right? It was like, oh, look, this is great. Look, this is great bureaucracy. Let's do it the way Kafka is saying we should do it. It's like, no, he wasn't describing a utopia. This wasn't Kafka's program. And so, you think about, there's a writer, I can never remember who. I should look this up. And he said that when he was young and was living in Brooklyn in the 50s, he said he had two bills. He had his rent for his apartment, and I think it was his water was a separate bill. So he had two bills a month. And he said, fast forward to 5 years ago when I read the article, or 10 years ago, and he said he has like 15. His phone bill, internet bill, cable bill. He just goes through all of these bills that he's like, wow, where does all this come from? What's going on? How have our lives become so complicated, so bureaucratic, so much just overhead? And I think we need to be really suspicious of this, because it often, again, requires us to think and behave and respond to the world in very particular ways that have nothing to do with us or our subjective desires or the way we would like things to be. And so, again, it just patterns us. It causes our sense of ourselves to be very different from what has traditionally been those elements that have fed the house of the intellect. And then personally, to be, if you can focus somewhat on the education that's broad-minded, ethical, historical, philosophical, psychological. So much of our education, both broadly, specifically in schools, but also outside of schools, they say, learn in 20 minutes a day. It's like, I don't know if people have seen these ads. This book has been reduced to 12 minutes. And I'm like, see, this is the problem, right? Like there's a metric, it's 12 minutes or just 20 minutes, or you can learn something valuable in just 7 minutes a day. Or, it's always got those metrics and you're going to get something valuable. And it's like, it takes me 7 minutes to understand a paragraph of Hegel. If 7 minutes, I'd just dream longer than that. And then how long do I have to think about it to incorporate it into my own mind? So it's thinking in these longer terms, historical, ethical, and philosophical modes is just really different, right? It's just a different pattern of encountering and understanding the world. And increasingly, because we value technical skills and specific certifications and very narrow outcomes, that broadness, that sense of shared environment and culture is essentially dying. I mean, there's not a big update from me on that one, but yeah, this is part of where it's struggling. So it's avoid the poison, resist the desire to measure and quantify, and hence conversely try to understand and explore the subjective. Try and limit technological dependence, or at least just understand it. Be suspicious of bureaucracy always, because it's always trying to guide you and turn you into cattle at some level, and we don't want to be cattle, I would say. And then focus as much as you can on the broad, on the deep, on the personal, and the historical, and the philosophical, and the ethical, because that's where the intellect really lives, and that's where our subjective experience can be expanded and explored. So here's just some homework. I'd love to give homework. So this is part of the series, is see if you can find places where you see, just notice where you're being asked to, or where you ridiculous measurements, right? Rather than a subjective view. So this should be completely easy. But if you just start noticing these, I think it's helpful, because once I recognize this pattern, which was probably Barzan, by the way, but I have this sneaking suspicion somebody else had got me onto this before, and then I read Barzan and was like, oh yeah, this has got to be right. But we'll just go with Barzan. That once you recognize this pattern and you learn to identify it, oh my gosh, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And then it becomes terrifying, because you realize these thought traps are just, it's like walking through a minefield. You encounter them all the time. 2 is just, again, a practice of what we think is write out, just pick 1 or 2 or 3 of your core beliefs, and then write out why you think these are true and or valuable. Not an argument of I'm going to prove that they are. Just here's what, I think this is true, and here's why I think it's true. And maybe they're silly reasons, and that you're like, I could attack that. That's fine. Don't worry about that. But just see if you can come up with the subjective explanation for where it is this comes from and why you believe it. Because again, I feel it's just rarely something that we're asked to do. It's assumed that everybody knows what they think, even though the evidence is 100% clear that we absolutely have a hard time doing this, because we're rarely asked to do it. And so when asked to, it often is difficult to articulate what we think, and then why, right? And 3, and following this is a little reading to go along this, is look for bureaucratic speech and patterns. And there's a great, and I'll link to this on the Patreon, there's a great work by George Orwell, his name just popped out of my head there for a second, called Politics in the English Language, in which he talks about why bureaucratic language, bureaucratic thought systems, being enmeshed in these systems is so damaging to our capacity to think and express ourselves, and how it creates this stranglehold and, a horrible word, I want to say unfreeze, entraps the mind. You can't unfree, right? Enslaves the mind. And, 1984 is famous for its doublethink and double plus good, and this just draining language of the capacity to express thought and subjectivity. And Orwell was concerned about this back then. Again, if he were alive today, I can only imagine. But when you read that, you're like, oh my gosh, he articulates it so well and so clearly that I think it's a very helpful read, one that kind of liberates and like, oh, right, like this is, and then once you read it, you just see it everywhere. And you're like, oh my gosh, we're inundated by it. So how do we help build the house of the intellect? How do we participate in it? How do we feel good and that we have a community in it? An important step is to free our minds, is to replace those areas and those people like doctors that you would expect to be on the team that are not there anymore, essentially because their minds and their experiences of life have been colonized. They have fallen prey to all of this. And if we can learn to, in our own lives, begin to free our minds and to think more clearly and to think better and more subjectively about our own experiences and how to express them, this provides the soil, this provides the ground in which that community and those experiences can grow. So, House of the Intellect, Part 3, Free Your Mind. Thank you very much.